What's up, guys? Welcome back to my channel, where today we have another fantasy video for you. Today we have the running backs. Start 'em, sit 'em. Let's get it. Now, first up, we have the Commanders versus the Bears on Thursday Night Football. This one is pretty simple. B-Rob, you're going to want to start. The Bears give up just over 33 fantasy points per game to running back, which is the second most in the NFL. Their defense is really, really awful. They also give up the most receiving yards and the most rushing total touchdowns to running backs. Robinson is averaging 15 fantasy points per game and a touchdown per game. He should feast on this Bears defense. Now, as for Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson, Herbert just had barely a good start this past week against another really bad defense, and he's been 25th or worst ranked in 3 out of the 4 games. I don't really trust him all that much. There's only been 1 week where a running back versus Washington has scored over 13 points. So it's kind of a hit or miss, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sit Khalil Herbert. I think unless he's your best option, he should sit. The same for Roschon Johnson. He just doesn't get any usage unless it's garbage time, and he averages under a 45% snap count, so I'm going to go ahead and sit him as well. Up next, we have the Bills versus the Jaguars. James Cook is going to be first. You're going to want to start him. He has the 12th ranked points in fantasy for running backs, averaging 14.5 per game. 7th most rushing yards total, 115 receiving yards, which is the 5th most. And the Jaguars allow 24 receptions to running backs, which is the 5th most as well. He hasn't really scored touchdowns, but I think he could really break that this week. So he's a definite start. Travis Etienne, the Bills are currently allowing 6 yards per carry to the running back position and almost 7 yards per touch. That's a pretty good average to start Etienne here. He's tied for the 7th most receptions to running backs, and he's in the top half of running back in fantasy. The Bills also are in the top half in the league in rushing yards allowed, so I think Etienne has a really good matchup here, and in the Jaguars offense, he should thrive. You're going to want to start him. Next up, we have the Falcons versus the Texans. First, you're going to want to start Bijan Robinson. He's averaging 17.5 fantasy points per game, 6th ranked running back. He averages 5 catches and 33 receiving yards per game. That's good for about 8 fantasy points right there. The Texans give up the 7th most points to running backs, 25.3 per game, and they've given up 5 rushing touchdowns, which are the 3rd most, tied for. So the Texans' rushing defense does not seem to be really it. And Bijan, with their offense, should get a lot of touches and a lot of carries. He should be the focal point there. As for Dameon Pierce, you're going to want to sit him. The Falcons give up only 12.9 fantasy points per game to running backs. That's the 2nd least in the entire NFL. They've given up 0 touchdowns, and Dameon, frankly, is only averaging about 9.7 points per game, ranked 27th running back, so he's even under a couple of the backups. And he's averaging under 3 yards per carry this season. There's no real reason to utilize him unless you're pretty much forced to, or until he shows something, because right now he is not performing this season. The Lions versus the Panthers are next. First, you're going to want to start David Montgomery. Carolina averages about 136.3 rushing yards per game allowed, which is the 6th most in the NFL. Montgomery is also averaging just under 20 PPR fantasy points per game in the NFL, which is the 10th most running back, even though he's missed a game. He's currently averaging in his 3 games 87 yards, 1 touchdown, which comes out to about 14 fantasy points alone right there. So he should be utilized a lot. As for our sits, we're going to want to sit Jahmyr Gibbs, 37% snap count average when Montgomery plays, so it's not a pretty good stat line. He also only averages about 9.72 points per game, ranked 26th running back. So he should be a sit until they prove to us that they're willing to use him more. So I would sit Jahmyr Gibbs. And Miles Sanders, Detroit only allows 14.5 or thereabouts points to a running back, which is the 5th least, and they only average allowing 60.8 rushing yards per game, which is the lowest in the NFL by like 3 or 4 yards. Sanders is currently averaging 10.72 fantasy points per game, and he hasn't scored over 11 with Bryce as his quarterback, so it doesn't seem Like, he's in the usage column when Bryce is at quarterback right now. So I would definitely sit him. Next up, we have the Colts versus the Titans. First, we got Derrick Henry. You're going to want to start him. He's pretty much their entire offense, to be honest. The Colts allow 126.8 rushing yards per game, the 10th most, and allowed 22 thereabouts points per game to running backs. Henry last year versus the Colts, pretty much the same Colts team, 23.7 and 16.8 points against Indianapolis with 92 rushing yards averaged between both of those games. He just kind of feasts on his divisional opponents. I'm not exactly sure why, but Derrick Henry is a must-start. As for the sits, you're going to want to sit both of the running backs in Indianapolis. First, Jonathan Taylor is reported to be back at practice, but he still doesn't want to play for them. Even if he does, I'm not sure what the dynamic is going to be like because he specifically said, I don't want to play for you, and a coach doesn't just forget that. So you're definitely sitting him. As for Zach Moss, especially if Jonathan Taylor plays, you're going to want to sit him. But even if he doesn't, the Titans only allow 13.2 fantasy points per game to running backs, third least. They allow the fourth least amount of rushing yards, and they've only allowed one rushing touchdown. Things are not looking good for Zach Moss's usage, and especially not now that Jonathan Taylor could be back. We have a very interesting matchup next between the Dolphins and the Giants. I didn't put Matt Breida up here, but he should be started if Barkley's not playing, but I'm going under the assumption Barkley is playing. Now, as for Devin Achane, he's the hot hand in Miami. He's got back-to-back 100-yard games and back-to-back games with 2 touchdowns. He's explosive. I think you should start both him and Raheem Mostert, as Miami has the best rushing offense in the entire NFL. And Mostert has the most touchdowns of a non-quarterback in the entire NFL. The Giants' rush defense is also really, really bad. Just 400. They've allowed 463 rush yards, the 4th most. So they should both be starts until proven that one of them is going to definitively take over for the other. As for Saquon, let's be honest, he's the entire offense when he plays. He scores all the points. The Dolphins allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to running backs, and they allow the 7th most receiving yards to running back, which is kind of Saquon's bread and butter. He's involved heavily in the pass game when he plays, so I would start all 3 of them in this game. Start all the running backs, for sure. Next up, we have the Saints and the Patriots. You're going to want to start Alvin Kamara. The Patriots have allowed 4 rushing touchdowns to running backs, tied for the 6th most. Kamara was targeted 14 times and caught 13 passes last week, which just proves that he is involved in the offense and takes kind of control when he's there. And the Patriots average about the league average of points allowed to running backs with just about 22, but Kamara, regardless, should always just be a start. As for Ramondre Stevenson, you're going to want to sit him. He's just averaging 10.7 points per game, ranked 23rd. He gets less than 3 yards per carry, which is insane. And the Saints don't really allow that many points to running backs. They have the 8th least to go along with the Patriots, only scoring 13.8 average points per game, which is the 3rd least in the NFL. Steelers versus Ravens are up next, and you're going to want to sit both of these guys. The Steelers have the 4th least rushing yards per game in the NFL with under 80, and Baltimore allows the 7th least. Najee's also sharing snap count with Warren, so he doesn't get any of the passes anymore, so he's just not really viable. Gus Edwards also needs to be benched. He's averaging 7 points per game, ranked 34th running back, and that's as a starter. He averages under 50% snap count, and he's not involved in the passing game, so there's no real reason to start him. Decent matchup up next between the Rams and the Eagles. For this one, you're going to want to start DeAndre Swift. He's got the 2nd most rushing yards in the NFL and the 10th most total fantasy points for running backs. The Eagles have the 2nd best rushing offense in the NFL as well, with 165.3 yards per game. So I think that Swift will still be a focal point, and he should be able to just take a bunch of carries, possibly get into the end zone. He's a start. Kyren Williams is a sit for me. I know that's not really the popular thing right now. He has the 3rd most points per game for running back, and he's totaled to 6 touchdowns. A total score of 6 touchdowns, 3rd most for running backs. The Eagles also allowed less than 65 rushing yards per game, second least in the NFL, and only allow 14 points per game to running backs, which is the seventh least. Because of those two factors, I'm going to sit Kyron, and I'm just going to wait and see what happens against this Eagles defense. I can't start him, unless you absolutely have to, of course. Really surprising matchup up next here between the Cardinals and the Bengals. The Bengals we expected to be better. I'm sure the Cardinals we expected to be worse. But you're going to want to go ahead and start James Conner and Joe Mixon. The Bengals allow the second most rushing yards per game in the NFL, and Conner currently has the fourth most rushing yards in the NFL. He's also pretty present in the passing game for Dobbs, so I think he's a definitive start. Joe Mixon, the Cardinals have allowed 32.1 fantasy points per game, which is the third most, and 8 touchdowns total, which is the second most to running backs. And this is probably Mixon's best matchup this year. If you're going to start him any week or you're questioning starting him, it should be this week. He won't have a better matchup than this. Alright, next up we have the Jets and the Broncos, and as I made this video, Breece Hall was just announced to have his workload just fully given to him, so he has no restrictions anymore. To go with that, the Broncos are the worst rush defense in the NFL. They allow the most fantasy points per game. They've allowed the most touchdowns, and Hall, this is kind of his last chance. He literally does not get any better than this for him. So if you have him, start him. This is his last chance. Javonte Williams and Samaje Perine, neither of them are serviceable options. They have continuously played from behind, which makes getting carries and having opportunities less. And to go along with it, Javonte's hurt, and Jaleel McLaughlin, the rookie, came out and performed brilliantly, outshined everybody, which kind of throws a wrench into this backfield because you don't know if they're going to utilize him now. Vikings and Chiefs are up next, as we've got Isaiah Pacheco and Alexander Mattison. Pacheco, I leaned towards sitting him, but you're going to want to start him. Minnesota allows just 15 fantasy points to running backs, which is the 10th least. But Kansas City has the 9th best rushing offense, and Pacheco has scored the 13th most running back points. So this is going to be I think that the Vikings are going to have to play from behind. So I think that Pacheco should have a lot of carry opportunities, and Alexander Mattison is going to be sat because Kansas City allows the 6th least running back points. And he's just under half the league average against above-average rush defenses, so he's performed very poorly. And the Vikings have the 5th worst rush offense in the NFL, but the 2nd best passing offense. So I think that just shows that Madison, for the time being, shouldn't be played. Alright, so this one was a tough one for me. I know that CMC and Tony Pollard are 2 of the best running backs in the NFL, but I leaned with benching Pollard and starting McCaffrey. The reason I'm benching Pollard is he hasn't scored a touchdown since week 1, and the 49ers have allowed a running back to score more than 10 points once. They also have the 3rd least amount of rushing yards per game, and pretty much a total of 170 rushing yards given. So it's not looking good for Pollard. He should get plenty of opportunities, I'm sure, but what he does with them, I'm not sure. McCaffrey, this is a definite start. He has the most total fantasy points in the NFL with 7 touchdowns. You're starting him. There's no way that you're not. That's as simple as that. And last but not least, you have the Raiders versus the Packers on Monday Night Football. You're going to want to start Josh Jacobs. He's used heavily in the passing game. He has the 2nd most receptions for running backs. Number 14 running back in fantasy, despite a very, very slow start. The Packers give up about 155.3 rush yards per game, which is the 3rd most in the NFL, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points per game to running backs with 29. Aaron Jones, the Raiders allow the 7th most rushing yards per game, and Jones is heavily used in the passing game. He's top 10 in fantasy usually when he plays healthy, so I would start Aaron Jones if you have him. As for A.J. Dillon, he's averaging 4 points per game this season and just 5 points per game when Aaron Jones wasn't playing. He also is only averaging 2 yards per carry, which is atrocious. It's probably the worst in the NFL, one of the worst for any running back. So A.J. Dillon should be a definite sit. And that's going to do it. Thank you guys so much for checking out my channel. my video. If you guys like more fantasy content, you want to see more of this, then make sure you smash that like button, subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll catch you guys in the next episode. Peace.